Thank you for being here. I'm Stuart Harris. I'm a counselor in the stake presidency, and we welcome you for our stake members and guests and friends. We're excited to hear from Brother Peterson and the things he has to share. We will start with an opening prayer from Sister Georgia Greaves from the Raleigh Hills Ward, and then I will kind of introduce the meeting from there.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to come together as students and listen to Brother Peterson and his knowledge and wisdom. And we ask a blessing that as we listen, that we might be able to gather the inspiration that Thou would have us learn from these stories and experiences. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Georgia. I failed to acknowledge that President George is here on the stand, and he's presiding at the meeting. We'd like to thank those who kind of helped get this together. Foremost, of course, Brother and Sister Peterson, who took some time out of their vacation here in the Pacific Northwest. They've discovered the beauties of the Pacific, the Oregon coast, and they apparently come here frequently. But also the Stake Communications Council, Dave Bodmer and Tracy Snoyer and Patty Goff. I'm forgetting, who am I forgetting? Ann and Wayne Sackley, who think about things that would be opportunities to be useful and good for members of the stake and other stakes to learn more, and as the handbook says, to bring the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out of obscurity. So tonight we've got the opportunity to learn quite a bit, I think, from Brother Peterson and his studies. The way it'll happen, I'm going to turn the time over to Brother Bodmer, who's going to introduce Brother Peterson, and then he will talk for about 50, 60 minutes. So about 8 o'clock, we will then, he'll still stay here, but then you have the opportunity to ask questions. So we have 2 roving mics that people can ask questions, and so we'll go for about an hour before then, and then close at about 8:30. So without further ado, Brother Bodmer.
I'm really happy to be here. I've followed Brother Peterson for many years, and his scholarship. Better? When I Googled Daniel C. Peterson, there was an Explore More little thing off to the side that listed him along with Terrell Givens, B.H. Roberts, and Hugh Nibley. And I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive company. Brother Peterson is a native of Southern California. He received a bachelor's degree in Greek and philosophy from BYU. After several years in Jerusalem and Cairo, he earned a PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures from UCLA. Returned to BYU, where he was professor of Islamic studies in Arabic, and he has authored several books and numerous articles on both Islamic and church subjects. He's a former chairman of the board of the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, FARMS, and has served as an officer, editor, and author of the Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship. Is named a Utah Academy Fellow and declared a lifetime member of the Utah Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters. Highlights in church service include a mission in Switzerland. French or German speaking? German speaking. Bishop at BYU, and a member of the church's Gospel Doctrine Committee. His wife of 47 years, Debbie, right here, is from Denver, and they have 3 children, 3 sons. Dr. Peterson's retired now. I think what that means is he's no longer at BYU. He retired in 2021, but he's remained actively engaged with research, writing, production of church history films, and his work at the Interpreter Foundation. And I've asked him to tell us a little bit about what he does that keeps him very busy. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 90, verse 15, Joseph Smith was urged to study and learn and become acquainted with all good books and with languages, tongues, and people. Brother Peterson's, after a lifetime, certainly taken that admonition to heart. And turn the time over to him.
Well, yeah. Can you hear me if it's at this level? Is that clear enough? Okay. It was mentioned that I served a German-speaking mission in Switzerland, and the stake member of the stake presidency said he served in Hamburg, and neither of our missions exists anymore. I don't know what that says about us. We had a fantasy. There was a time in Switzerland when a number of members of the Quorum of 12 came through, but they didn't meet with the saints. I never did know what this was about. They were coming from other places, but they would come through Switzerland. And the fantasy in Switzerland among the missionaries was it was such a difficult mission. We had so little success that all of the 12 were going to gather on the shores of either Lake Zurich or Lake Geneva and wash their feet off against the country and shut it down. Never happened. It was a great mission. I mean, it's like tracting in a national park. Switzerland is so beautiful. But it's also like tracting in a national park in the sense that you're tracting among the bears, and nobody wanted to hear. So a frustrating place, but warm memories. Still one of my favorite places on the planet is Switzerland. I've been asked to talk here about the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and I was also invited, I think, to say something about the Interpretive Foundation. Let me say something about that, because I encourage you to go and look it up online. I don't even remember what the... Interpretivfoundation.org. I have it bookmarked, so I never even think about it, but it's free. I can do this in a chapel setting, I think, because we're not asking for your money. Well, actually, I'd love to, but not in the chapel. It's a tax-exempt organization, but we put up everything there for free, or when we do things, we do them typically at cost. So the idea is to get the word out there, and we do a lot of things. Publish a weekly article online in our journal, Interpreter, Journal of Latter-day Saint Faith and Scholarship. We've done movies, books, conferences, all sorts of things. It's just amazing how much has been done. And what I'm going to be riffing off of tonight, I think, in a little way, is our first major film project, which was called Witnesses. Let me give you a little background story on that very, very quickly. I have long been interested in the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, fascinated by them, not seeing any real way around them. They're pretty powerful, pretty impressive testifiers. And I've always had an interest in films, but I never thought that would come together. I never imagined myself as a movie impresario. But we had some friends, a friend in our ward, who did films for PBS and things like that. And we were talking one day about the need to make films for Latter-day Saints and to convey the message beyond the Latter-day Saints if we could. And we began toying with various ideas, and all of a sudden we were in the movie business. He recruited some of his friends, and now I imagine myself cruising around in a Lamborghini or something like that. But it's a non-profit thing and so forth. I can't figure it out. I haven't made a dime. But one of the things that we decided to do, we were going to do a series of profiles on scholars and artists within the Latter-day Saint tradition who had done something sort of unusual in terms of expressing the gospel. Like we still have in mind someday maybe to do a profile of an artist that we all like. We started off by doing a profile of Robert Kundick. That name may mean something to some of you. He was the associate tabernacle organist and a composer and so on and so forth. And he was over in Jerusalem when I was teaching at the Jerusalem Center. And my wife asked his wife one day, so has anyone ever done a profile of your husband on a film or anything like that? She said, no, never, nobody ever has. But he was a really interesting character. He was the organist on the organ in the Jerusalem Center. If some of you have been there, you know it's the best organ in the Middle East. And he was also the organist for the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer downtown in Jerusalem. And he made a real impact. We began having guests come to the center. The center became a tourist attraction in its own right. which I don't think we really expected, but Israelis would bring out-of-country guests to the Jerusalem Center, and he would always do an organ recital for them. It was pretty spectacular on this pipe organ there, with a view that cannot be beaten in the city of Jerusalem, a view of the old city. Any of the luxury hotels in the city would kill to have this view. They don't have it. But we're up there on the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus, looking over the old city, and they can be looking at that while listening to this pipe organ. It's absolutely wonderful. So we began doing a concert series there, and it became the place to be in Jerusalem on a Sunday night, typically, because the Sabbath in the Jerusalem branch was Saturday. And so we'd have people coming there, it was like a who's who of Israeli society. It was really amazing. And if you know anything about the history of the center, you know that there was a lot of opposition to the building of that center. And so now it had become a fixture of the Jerusalem skyline, one of the most visible buildings in the city, and people would come there to have their pictures taken by the center and so on and so forth, and they'd come for these concerts. And the tickets were free, but you had to have tickets. And when he left, they put on a special concert for him, sort of a tribute, and it was astonishing to see who was there. The Speaker of the Knesset, various ambassadors, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, ambassador to France, cabinet ministers, and so on, all came there for this. Presidents of the major universities in Jerusalem and so on. So we did a movie about Bob, just half an hour. It was shown on BYU TV. And that inspired us with what we might be able to do, and eventually we had the idea of doing this film, Witnesses, a feature film. And it turned out, I thought, amazingly well. I remember the first night I saw the whole thing. The color had not been regularized, the sound hadn't quite been fixed, but it was the whole thing. And I remember walking down to our friend's house to see it and thinking, what if it's terrible? I've never seen the whole thing. What if it stinks? It might. And I was pleased. It was pretty good. So anyway, but that has reflected a lifelong interest in the Witnesses for me, but also deepened my involvement with the Witnesses. And we did a docudrama afterwards about the Witnesses, interviewing scholars and so on. But I'm going to talk about the Witnesses tonight because I think we don't fully appreciate how strong their testimony is. And I've put it this way, I've given a lot of lectures, since I do Middle Eastern things and I hang around with people who do Middle Eastern and Mesoamerican things. Some names may mean something to you, like Jack Welch, John W. Welch, and so on, people like that. This is the world I kind of have lived in for decades now. But even though I think there's a lot of evidence for the Book of Mormon that comes out of the Middle East and is beginning to come out of the Americas, there's only one kind of, if you will, secular evidence that the Lord has given us himself. He didn't give us chiasmus. Well, maybe he did. He inspired Jack to find it, maybe. But in the very direct way, he gave us the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. I mean, very direct. They are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. They are mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. They were called by the Lord, and an angel was sent to address them, and so on. So we ought to be paying real attention to the witnesses. You can get a spiritual witness of the Book of Mormon without knowing anything about them, I suppose, but the Lord gave us the witnesses, and he wants us to pay attention. And we actually began to notice that many Latter-day Saints were not really paying much attention to them. I remember sort of informally asking people occasionally, so, can you name the three witnesses? And I'd get things like Sidney Rigdon, Brigham Young, I think. And, anyway, oh wow, we've got a lot of work to do. People need to understand this story better. And so I'm going to talk tonight, fairly briefly, I will watch the clock, about the three groups of witnesses that we have and how, to me, they form a really impressive body of testimony. Of course, the first group is the three witnesses, and they were the focus of our film, Witnesses. So here you have an actual photograph. Bet you didn't know it existed, but there they are gathering for prayer just before the appearance of the angel. So Martin Harris, then Joseph Smith, and David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery. I was really pleased, by the way, with our Oliver Cowdery. We now have a photograph of Oliver Cowdery. It's almost certainly authentic. And this actor, who's not even a Latter-day Saint, looks a whole lot like Oliver Cowdery. It's pretty amazing. You may know the story that they prayed and nothing happened. prayed again, nothing happened. Martin Harris felt that it was his lack of faith, and so he moved away. And then the angel appeared, and they saw the plates and everything else. And then Joseph went and found Martin, who was depressed, disappointed, feeling unworthy, and so on. And Martin had his own experience of the angel, exactly like what David and Oliver had. But here you see them all together at the beginning of that experience. There's not only the 3 witnesses, but the 8 witnesses. This is again a scene from our documentary, Undaunted. But there is also a group of witnesses that I call the unofficial witnesses, or the informal witnesses, and I want to talk a little bit about them too. So how are they different? How are they different? And what can we make of this? I used to think that it was kind of redundant to have the 8 witnesses. The 3 witnesses were pretty powerful. Why do we have 8? And it's a different kind of experience. That should have been a clue to me. And then I began to learn about the unofficial witnesses, and I'm going to name the ones that I know of tonight, with one exception. A friend of mine has discovered what we think is another witness, non-LDS, never joined the church, but left a memoir of having gone to the Smith home and hefted the plates while they were covered. Joseph and Hiram weren't there, but Lucy Mack said, well, I guess you can hold them as long as you don't look at them. And he held them and left testimony about it. He's actually a very prominent person. You would recognize a company that he co-founded that is still around today, but he lived in Palmyra and visited the Smith household. But I don't want to steal my friend's thunder. I'm trying to persuade him to write this up. If you won't do it, we can co-author it. I want this out there. Anyway, the person who impressed me most on the witnesses and who got me going was Richard L. Anderson, who was the authority on the witnesses until his death in 2018. When our film came out, Witnesses, it was dedicated to Richard Lloyd Anderson, a witness to the witnesses. I felt that he deserved that. And the book that I recommend from him, this is the first thing he published on them, is called Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses. It's still available in print, and I think it's one of the great books in Latter-day Saint scholarship ever. I don't know how you can come away from this not impressed with the witnesses, that they were sane, they were respectable, respected, until they got involved with the restoration of the gospel. Then their reputation suffered a bit. But up till then, and thereafter in many cases, they were well respected by people who otherwise thought this was all pretty weird. So this is the starting place, it seems to me, for any study of the witnesses. And this is what he says, you can read it on the screen. No testimony of direct revelation in the world's history is better documented than the testimony of the Book of Mormon witnesses. Now, Richard speaks with some authority. He got a Harvard law degree and then decided he didn't want to be a lawyer. And so he went back to school and got a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in ancient history. And so his specialty was on historical documentation and testimony. And he devoted much of his life to studying the witnesses, and he was a meticulous historian. He was the kind of person who, if he heard of a document that might have Martin Harris's signature on it, he would cross the continent to have a look at it. He had to see it, hold it in his own hands, know what it was like and all about it. So very, very careful. And when he says something, you can pretty well take it to the bank. So anyway, I've already mentioned interpreter, and this is our website. As it currently stands, it's about to change massively. But we got involved in making this film, and here's a scene of Martin Harris behind the screen, Joseph on the other side, Emma is coming into the room, and that guy over there on the right is our director, Mark Goodman. The camera and so on is not original to the period, and the sound equipment. But you see, we tried to tell the story honestly and carefully. And I'll say this, I had a member of the 70s say to me, we really like what you're doing. We can't do what you're doing because in some cases we had to show conflict. Why did the 3 witnesses leave the church? They didn't just wake up one morning and say, I've decided to be evil. They had real issues, and we tried to paint them sympathetically, but it makes them even more impressive because they never back away from their testimonies. But this member of the 70s said to me, we can't do that kind of thing in visitor-centered films. They're very short. We don't want to emphasize conflict and drama and that sort of thing. So we showed scenes in which witnesses get angry. Martin Harris is complaining. He feels that his ego has been bruised. He hasn't been treated fairly. He hasn't gotten the leadership positions he wanted, and things like that. And we show a scene where Joseph loses his temper. He explodes when Martin has lost the manuscript pages. You can imagine, he thought his soul was lost. He was very upset by this. We showed a scene, and I know this bothered some people, where Joseph is burying his firstborn child. And Emma says, "But Joseph, aren't you a prophet?" "Yes." "Doesn't the Lord speak to you?" "Well, he doesn't speak to me now." She says, "Why can't you just raise him from the dead?" And he said, "It doesn't work that way." Now, we don't know exactly what he said on that occasion, but the actor who played that role told me afterwards something very interesting. He said he's digging the grave, and suddenly he just begins digging almost madly with the shovel. And he said, for just a few seconds, I wasn't acting. I felt what Joseph must have felt at that time. I'm trying so hard to do everything you want me to do. You've allowed my firstborn son to die? What more can I do for you? And he didn't understand. So we're trying to show the human story, which makes the supernatural story, the divine story, all the more powerful, it seems to me. That the Lord is working through people who are flawed and who have challenges and so on. So these are the films that resulted from that, Witnesses and Undaunted. Undaunted, I know, is streaming for free online now. I think Witnesses, probably not, but it's on several platforms. And then we've done some short features and so on. But I don't want to make this a commercial. I want to talk about these three groups in sequence. So first, the three witnesses. They were called to experience this, what they experienced, in the Peter Whitmer cabin. Many of you have probably been there near Fayette, New York, and this is a reconstruction, but as close as they can make it to what the original cabin looked like, where the church was organized, where a lot of the formative events of the church were conducted. And these are the three witnesses. There is what I think is an authentic image of Oliver Cowdery. He died young. He died in 1850. He wasn't that old when he passed away. David Whitmer lived to a ripe old age, and so we have a picture of him in his elderly years. And Martin Harris, who lived to be quite old, died in 1875. Martin came out to Utah at the end of his life. He'd been estranged from the church, but he came back. Oliver Cowdery was going to come back. David Whitmer never did. But in some ways, that makes his witness to me stronger, and I'll come back to that. Now, here's the testimony of the three witnesses, and you're familiar with this, I hope. And here are some phrases that I want to single out. They testify, "We have seen the plates. We know that they have been translated by the gift and power of God, for his voice hath declared it unto us. We declare with words of soberness that an angel of God came down from heaven, and he brought and laid before our eyes that we beheld and saw the plates and the engravings thereon. And then the voice of the Lord commanded us that we should bear record of it. Wherefore, to be obedient unto the commandments of God, we bear testimony of these things." And they felt really strongly about this. David Whitmer said later on in one interview that Moroni told him, "Now you have seen with your eyes. If you ever deny this, you will be damned. Because you've had a perfect, sure witness, and you know. And you cannot back away no matter what." And he never did. Whatever else he went through, he never did. So here again is that experience as they're beginning to pray, going out in a clearing of the woods to pray. Now, this is something that is interesting to me, and I noticed it relatively recently. This is a promise that's made to the witnesses in Doctrine and Covenants 17:1. This is before their experience. "You shall have a view of the plates, and also of the breastplate, the sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim, and the miraculous directors." Now that's a kind of program, that's a promise of what they're going to see. It seems to me it's sort of daring on the part of Joseph Smith, if he's faking this, to predict what kind of hallucination or whatever it is they're going to have, if it's a hallucination or something like that. We'll come back to the idea that he manufactured the props. But here is the testimony of David Whitmer, in which he says, many years later, he showed to us the plates, the angel did, the sword of Laban, the directors, that is the Liahona, the Urim and Thummim, and other records. There appeared as it were a table with many records on it, besides the plates of the Book of Mormon, also the sword of Laban, the directors, and the interpreters. I saw them as plain as I see this bed, striking his hand upon the bed beside him. Now that's like you had a checklist in Doctrine and Covenants 17:1, and here you have David Whitmer checking off all the items that they were promised to see, and they did see them all. Now, this comes from an interview with a Colonel Giles and Joseph Smith III and a couple of other people who were interviewing David. He was the most interviewed witness. He lived until 1887 and was interviewed scores and scores of times. In fact, it has been said that there was scarcely a day that went by when someone didn't come by to pester him, and usually they were there to mock, to the point where he got really upset and didn't want to talk to people. But they said that if you once got him going on the subject, he would warm up. And then, yes, he would bear you a firm testimony. And the actor that we have playing the senior David Whitmer in our film, a guy named Paul Kandarian from Boston, not LDS, didn't know anything about the church, but he captures the word curmudgeon, I think, really, really well in that film. A reporter comes by to see him. It's a report that we kind of made up out of several reporters who actually did this. And he at first tells him, basically, go away, leave me alone. I don't want to talk to you. And then eventually warms up and tells him a story all night long, which we know happened, about what had happened in his life, and bears powerful testimony of what he saw. And of course, the reporter asks him, well, didn't you leave the church? Yes. But the church left me. That is, he was on board with the early church, and then he became disaffected with things that happened later on, but he never backs away from his testimony of the Book of Mormon. Now, to me, this is important. I don't really care what happened to him. I mean, I do, but I don't care in a way what happened to him after his experience with the plates, so long as he's true to his testimony. It's like asking somebody who's seen an accident from a street corner, tell us about the accident. That's what you're interested in, because that person is an expert on the accident. He or she saw the accident, speaks with authority. You don't ask, what do you think about Chevys generally? What do you think about Fords, Maseratis, whatever it is your question is? What do you think about Italian Grand Opera? Who cares what he thinks about those subjects? He has no authority on those things. His authority is on what he saw. That's what David Whitmer has authority on, and he remains faithful to it forever. Now, one of my favorite explanations for David's lifelong faithfulness to the Book of Mormon and to his testimony is that he was terrified of Brigham Young. Brigham Young would have had him done in, if he'd ever dared to tell the sordid truth about the church. Well, here are a couple of things. David Whitmer lives to 1887. Brigham Young dies in 1877. So he's got 10 years where he's in the clear, right? He can say anything he wants. Brigham's not going to get him. But that's just ludicrous anyway. It doesn't explain what happened. He went out of his way to bear his testimony. We show a scene in the documentary Undaunted that I really like, which is true. It's all true, where he's going around to prominent people in Richmond, Missouri. Now, he was sufficiently well thought of in Richmond, Missouri, where there'd been an extermination order against the saints, right? They didn't like Latter-day Saints there, but David stays in Missouri, and he becomes so respected. At one point, he serves as the mayor of Richmond, Missouri. And they all know that he's one of those witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and he won't back away. And there's a wonderful interview that I don't think has been widely enough published by an unnamed Chicago man. That's what he's called, Chicago man, in a Chicago newspaper. The newspaper goes to him and says, look, you lived in Missouri, you knew David Whitmer. What do you say about David Whitmer? Well, he said he was an honest man. We could never see what he had to gain by bearing his testimony of the Book of Mormon. If anything, he lost by doing it. It hurt his reputation. It damaged his business. But he said, and this is a striking line, he says, his word would have sent a man to the gallows faster than that of any other man I've ever known. Now, what did he mean by it? It's kind of an odd way of saying it, but the point was that if David Whitmer said he was guilty, then he was guilty, because David Whitmer would not lie. He would not tell an untruth or shade things. And he said he was an impressive man, and we were all just left mystified, by this testimony that he bore of the Book of Mormon. Well, I can suggest a possible way of understanding it. that it really happened. How about that? But they couldn't permit that. But anyway, here's the thing I really like, and I just saw this again just a few weeks ago. This is his tombstone, the marker on his grave in Richmond, Missouri. And it says on what, well, look on top. There are two books. It's hard to tell they're books, but that's what they are. They're two carved books on the top of this pillar. And then it says on one side, the record of the Jews and the record of the Nephites are one. Truth is eternal. And here's David Whitmer, after his death, bearing his testimony of the Book of Mormon. Do you think that's motivated by fear of Brigham Young? I don't see how it could be. And so he is wanting people to hear his testimony. He's not doing it because he's afraid. He's not reluctant. He's proclaiming it, that he knows what he saw. He knows what he heard. So again, I'll quote from Richard Anderson. Nothing short of biblical Christianity furnishes such a concrete statement of supernatural reality. One cannot dismiss the experience easily, for each man so testifying impressed his community with his capacity and unwavering honesty, and all three consistently reaffirmed the experience in hundreds of interviews throughout their lives. And we have at least 87 interviews recorded from David Whitmer, and there must have been scores of others that were never written down. We have a similar number, in a way, short ones, with Martin Harris. Ulrich Cowdery not so much because he died young. But nevertheless, David Whitmer says he died the happiest man I ever saw. He died in David Whitmer's home. And he said, the one thing he said when he was dying was, David, don't ever deny your testimony of the Book of Mormon. And then I will see you again in the next world. Okay, so I want to talk about the 8 witnesses. Very different experience. This is a painting, common painting that was used in visitor centers for a long time, may still be. My one complaint about it is I doubt that any of them had suits quite that nice on the American frontier in that period. They're dressed up a little better than they probably could. But there are a couple of things about their testimony. If you compare it to the testimony of the 3 witnesses, the testimony of the 8 is very different. It's restrained, it's matter of fact, it's kind of legalistic, as many plates as the said Smith had, we did see with our eyes and hold with our hands. They saw the plates which they said had the appearance of gold. They don't say it's gold, they say it looked like gold. We didn't do an assay test on it or anything like that, but it was gold, and these are people who'd seen gold coins. I mean, gold was in circulation in those days. They saw the engravings on the plates, which they said had, quote, the appearance of ancient work and of curious workmanship. They can't testify that they're really ancient words, but looked like it to them. They make no claim to have seen the Liahona, the breastplate, the sword of Laban, or the Urim and Thummim. No supernatural experience, no audible divine voice or heavenly confirmation. And then they use the word heft. We hefted, which gives a sense of heaviness. And to me, that's really important. The 3 witnesses never touched the plates in that experience. They see them at a distance. They hear the voice of God. They see the angel at a distance. The 8 witnesses go out into a clearing in a grove of trees, we think about 1 p.m. And the plates are handed around. They hold them, they turn them, they feel them. Nothing supernatural there. Now, one of my favorite of all of the witnesses is John Whitmer, who nearly denied his testimony, closest any of the witnesses ever came. But he didn't. And this is what's interesting about it. At one point, Theodore Turley is sent back into Missouri. There's an extermination order out on the Saints, and he's sent back to try to recover some money from the property of the Saints, pennies on the dollar, so he can help them settle in Nauvoo. It's very dangerous, very courageous on his part to have undertaken the assignment. But he runs into John Whitmer, and he says, John, you were one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. You've left the church. What's going on? Do you no longer believe in the Book of Mormon? And Whitmer says something really interesting. He says, I don't know if the Book of Mormon is true or not. He said, I couldn't read what was written on those plates. Now, to me, that's really interesting, because he doesn't get the divine testimony, the audible voice saying this is true. All he's there to do, and all I require him to do, is to testify there were plates. And he says, yeah, I held them. They were really heavy. And the writing was strange, but I couldn't read it, so I don't know if it's translated correctly. But then he bounces back. That's at his worst. He's been excommunicated about a month before, right? He's pretty mad. So he bounces back, and he bears strong testimony for the rest of his life, along with his brother David. But he's in a really bad mood right then. Even then, he could have said, I didn't really see him. Joseph had us say that, but we didn't really. I never got to touch them. They looked fake to me. But he doesn't say anything like that. He says, well, yeah, there were plates. He estimates they weighed about 45 pounds, something like that. But the writing on them was odd. So, to me, he says the one thing he needs to say, which is, yes, I was asked to testify that Joseph had plates, and he had them. I held them, I turned them, that sort of thing. So, again, going to Richard Anderson, 8 farmers and artisans publicly reported that Joseph Smith had shown them ancient plates of the Book of Mormon. A practical group who worked with their hands, they were better able to evaluate the appearance of gold and the curious workmanship than 8 picked at random from a modern city. Now, I've heard people say, oh, look, they lived in kind of a pre-modern age. They were really superstitious. They really couldn't tell reality from fantasy. And I ask you, we are currently sitting in an air-conditioned room, artificial climate, with artificial lighting. Who's separated from reality? They worked all day out there digging wells, building fences, moving rocks, sowing seeds, harvesting. They were connected with reality in a way that I'm not. I work all day sitting at a computer. That's not exactly reality in the same way that they experienced. So it seems to me very condescending and kind of ridiculous for us to be looking at them and saying, they couldn't tell reality from fantasy. When they said they held a 45, 50-pound object of gold in their hands, they knew that they'd held it, and they could probably estimate its weight pretty well. Okay, so there are the 2 groups of official witnesses. I want to say something more about them. How sincere were they? Well, one of the stories that impresses me is the story of the mission to the Lamanites in the winter of 1831. Oliver Cowdery pushed and pushed and pushed to do this. He wanted to take the message of the Book of Mormon out to the Indian tribes, which were on the borders of the United States or just a little beyond them, that is just beyond Kansas City, Missouri. He wanted to take the message to what he saw as the descendants of the Lamanites, the people of the Book of Mormon. Now, the winter they went on this trip was 1,500 miles, by the way, mostly on foot, and the worst winter that anybody in living memory could remember. It was terrible. They were walking through snow up to their knees almost all the time. They couldn't eat their bread some days because it was frozen. Their faces were being blasted with snow. And at a certain point, if I'm Oliver Cowdery, and this was all a kind of joke, I'd be thinking to myself, all right, it was funny while it lasted, but I'm out of here. I'm not going to walk out to the borders of Missouri. But he did. And with at least one other of the witnesses, Peter Whitman Jr., who went with him. Now, both of them, if you're a critic and you say this is all fraud, they both know this is a joke. And what are they gaining by walking out there under the frontier 1,500 miles in blizzards? I think a joke might be funny for a day, but it took them 9 months. So, anyway, were they sincere? I think clearly so. Did Oliver Cowdery really believe it? Yes, he did. But let's talk about the unofficial witnesses. William Smith is one of them. William was Joseph's little brother, kind of a crotchety character. Joseph and William actually came to blows on at least one occasion that I know of. They both had tempers. Richard Bushman thinks that was, when Joseph pleads guilty to having been guilty of sins that were not worthy of his calling, he says it was probably his temper. He was a big, strong guy, and he could let fly sometimes. And he did with his little brother, who was not very little either, so you can imagine what that was like. But William says, look, people said, well, Joseph was lying. He said, well, we all believed him. If Joseph had been an untruthful boy, we wouldn't have believed these tall tales he was telling, but we'd never known him to lie. And then he actually held the plates. He estimated the weight again at about 45 to 50 pounds. And so he goes to his death, estranged from the church, but bearing his testimony of the Book of Mormon. Josiah Stoll, this is one that I learned about only relatively recently, in the past 5 or 10 years, I think. I didn't know he was out there. Well, I knew he was out there, but I didn't know he was a witness of the Book of Mormon. Josiah Stoll is the person for whom Joseph worked for a little while, digging things on his farm property and repairing wells and fences and so on. Well, Josiah Stoll is one of the earliest believers outside the Smith family in the story of Joseph Smith and the Restoration. And at one point, he's not on trial, he's testifying in a trial where Joseph is being accused of, quote, glass-looking and imposing upon the gullible people around him. And Josiah Stoll is one of those supposedly defrauded by him. And Josiah Stoll says, no, I know he had the power to see things at a distance because he showed it to me. And he says, I also know that he had the plates. And I said, well, how did you know that? I mean, you never saw them. He said, but I did. And it turns out that at one point they were handed to him in a muslin cloth through a window to hide because there was a mob coming. He took them to hide them, and the covering came off the plates, and he caught a glimpse of them. He said, I saw the metal under there. I know he had plates, and they were really heavy. So here's another witness, another unofficial witness. And one of the things I like about the unofficial witnesses is you can say, well, the 3 witnesses were programmed to see what they saw. So are the 8 witnesses, maybe. The unofficial witnesses weren't. This usually happens spontaneously. They don't expect it, and suddenly they have an experience and testify of it for the rest of their lives. And that is true of Lucy Harris. You know her as the sort of evil character, who opposes the Book of Mormon translation, is angry at her husband, and all this sort of thing. Well, at one point, she has a dream. This is told us by Lucy Smith, but she has a dream in which she said an angel appeared to her in a dream and said, stop speaking evil of the Lord's anointed. Now you might say, well, that's Lucy Smith making it up. Well, but we do know one thing. The very first donor to the translation of the Book of Mormon, the very first person to give them food to sustain them, to feed them while they were doing the work, was Lucy Harris. I mean, for one brief moment, Lucy Harris was on board with the project. Then, for reasons that may be psychologically interesting, she backed away. There's one thing to know about her. She was profoundly deaf. And at an age before hearing aids and things like that, a kind of paranoia was common among people who simply couldn't hear and began to assume that everyone is talking about them, talking behind their backs. And that's been one explanation for her. But she is, in her way, a witness of the Book of Mormon. You wouldn't expect that. Lucy Mack Smith definitely is. At one point, she gets to hold the breastplate, and she says at one point she could actually see the glint of the metal through the cloth that was covering it. She could feel the shape of it. It was the size of an unusually large man. And she saw the Urim and Thummim and things like that. So there's another witness. Catherine Smith, later Catherine Smith Salisbury, Joseph's little sister, at one point is asked to hide the plates. He comes running home. This shows him he's exhausted. He's been chased by a mob in the woods. And he comes in with the plates and asks to have them hidden because the mob is coming. And she takes them in and actually carries them and said they were really heavy. She staggered under the weight. She was very young at this point. She's only about 15. She staggers under the weight. She goes in, puts them under the covers in her bed and pretends to be sick and asleep, and the mob comes in. But they decide not to bother her because, they're not going to be there. And they were on the bed. But she later testified, I know he had the plates and they were heavy. Emma Smith is one of my favorites. If you were to see my bedroom, you would know that next to my side of the bed, piles of papers grow. They're like, remember the stalactites or stalagmites, whichever they are, they grow up in a cave. They just rise. And, I mean to repent, but there's always another book that I'm working on that I lay it aside and go to sleep. And so papers, books, everything all by the side of the bed. I've been tempted, because of the story of Emma Smith, to say, oh, they're not really there. You're just having a spiritual experience, dear. Because Emma Smith used to have to dust around their little cabin there. And at one point, she says, Joseph was out, and there were the plates covered up on the table. And she had to move them to do some cleaning. She said they're extremely heavy. But also, she says, and you can tell she's spending some quality time with the plates. I've always wanted to ask her. I do want to ask her, come on, Emma. You say you never saw them, but didn't you? I would have. lift the cloth and have a look. She said, I know my husband had them because I had to move them around while dusting and things like that. And she said, I could stand there and I could move the top plate and move it across the ones below, and it would make a rustling metallic sound. I could feel along the edges. It was like the pages of a thick book. I felt the rings on the other side that bound the plates together. I know he had the plates. And so I've had people say, oh, no, the witnesses were just hallucinating. They were just imagining things. Well, that's why I say Emma Smith was just, while doing housework, was having a spiritual experience, imagining the plates. Sure, right. That seems to me a pretty prosaic daily activity and not a spiritual high. She's not deep in prayer or fasting. She's just cleaning the cabin. And then here's one of the most famous now. Mary Whitmer, who was the mother of David Whitmer, had an experience where they were translating in her house. And she was getting kind of upset by this. The records are pretty clear. She was having to do all the milking of the cows and all the housework while the men were doing the important stuff, as men often do, They're not doing any of the housework. They're just solving world problems and things like that. And she was at the point where she wanted to get Joseph and Oliver out of her house, have them, because people were coming by, wanting to gawk and look at what was going on. And she was sick of it, frankly, tired of it. And then one day, to make matters worse, she sees Joseph and Oliver, and they've gone down to a pond near the Whitmer farm, and they're skipping rocks on the pond. I imagine, because these are two farm guys who are tired of being in a darkened room translating, hunched over the plates and hunched over, taking dictation, they have to get out and do something. And she says, well, they could have milked the cows if they need exercise. And so she wants to throw them out. And one day she's out working in the barn, and a stranger comes and calls her by name. She doesn't know who it is. She later called him Brother Nephi, but she didn't know who it was. And he says basically, Mary, I know you're having a terrible time. It's only fair that you should have a view of what this is about. And he shows her the plates and lets her turn the pages of the plates. She never complains after that. We know this story from two sources. David tells us, and another grandson tells us that he heard the story separately. She told the story multiple times. That's really, really interesting to me. And she was not spiritually seeking a witness of the plates. She was wanting to throw them out. And so this experience happens, and she never complains again. Pretty amazing thing to me. Okay, so here are the unofficial witnesses that I have cataloged, leaving the one off that I want to add to the list. These private encounters with the metal book preceded both the 3 witnesses seeing the angel in the plates and also the 8 witnesses handling the plates in natural surroundings. And in some ways, these people, these 7 witnesses, have the same experiences that the 3 and the 8 have individually. They're not part of a group psychology or anything like that. They have the experiences unexpectedly. Now, there's something else that's interesting about them. Out of those 7 witnesses there, 5 are women, which I think is significant. The question occurred to me at one point, why are none of the official witnesses women? And it occurred to me there's a very clear reason for it. Women were not allowed to vote in the 19th century. Women weren't allowed to testify in court except in very, very precise cases. They were not regarded as being mentally or emotionally capable of bearing straightforward testimony. So they weren't going to be given a chance. I managed to amass at one point a number of cartoons making fun of the idea of women serving on juries. Oh, they'd be so emotional, and they just never come to a firm judgment or anything like that. So don't allow women to do it. So I'm thinking if there had been women among the official witnesses to the Book of Mormon, they would have been laughed out. It wouldn't have carried any weight with the early 19th century audience. I mean, think of it this way. The last state in the Union to allow women to serve on juries was, I believe, and this may not surprise you, Alabama. Okay? But think of a very famous play. I just saw it again a few weeks ago, made into a very famous movie called 12 Angry Men. Has anyone seen that or familiar with the story? It's a great play, by the way, great movie. Henry Fonda and Lee J. Cobb, and anyway, a whole bunch of great Hollywood actors. But it's about a jury that is hung up in a criminal case. And it's set in, I don't know, what would you say, the 50s? I'd say the 50s. But think about the title of the play, 12 angry men, okay? Even as late as the 50s, it was not unusual to have an entirely male jury. We'd never do that now, and some reversions and remade versions of the play call it 12 Angry Jurors and have a mixed jury and so on. But that was the attitude, okay? Now, it's not only in 19th century America, and I want to say something very quickly about ancient history, and then I think I will actually be able to conclude this about on time. Unofficial witnesses. Think of who's not in the original group of the apostles in the New Testament. But who are the first people at the tomb? Who are the first people to see that Jesus is risen from the dead? It's women. Now, I want to call your attention to the opening verses of 1 Corinthians 15, that marvelous chapter from Paul on the resurrection of Christ. It lists witnesses, okay? It lists the 12, individual members of the 12, and then last of all, Paul says, as one who's unworthy, he appeared to me. But who does he leave out? He leaves out the women, because the testimony of women was not acceptable in first century Jewish courts. It would have carried no weight at all. In fact, it might have been a detraction from the truth. So even though they're mentioned prominently, you could say, in a way, they're the very first witnesses of the resurrection. Not mentioned in Paul's list, because Paul was a Pharisaic lawyer, right? He knew the law, he knew the standards of evidence and the rules, and he was not going to violate them. So we don't know if he didn't know about the women's stories. This is very early, maybe written down before the Gospels were written down. Or even if he knew them, would he have included them? Probably not, because it would have seemed frivolous. But there you have a really dramatic scene of Mary Magdalene encountering the risen Christ. And I want to say something about this which is not directly relevant to my theme today, but you may remember what the Savior says there. She comes and he says, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father which is in heaven." Now that's a mistranslation, by the way. He doesn't say, "Touch me not." He says, "Stop holding me." And that changes the scene dramatically. The Greek has been mistranslated. It's what's called an inceptive aorist. It's a verb that means to be doing something already, and so to negate that means to stop doing what you're doing right now. And the verb is haptomai, which means to hold on to. It's the same verb that's used in modern Greek for fastening adhesive tape to something. So, and I kind of picture Mary not holding back like that, and him, in a lordly fashion, holding her off. I imagine her throwing herself at him and just holding on to him, and he's having to sort of peel her off and saying, "I can't stay. I've got to go, but I'll come back. Tell them that I'll come back, but I can't stay." So it's something more like this. But those witnesses, the witnesses of the women, don't show up in Paul, and they're ignored in many cases, but they are the first ones to know that Jesus is risen from the dead, and they go to the apostles and tell them, and how do the apostles respond? It seemed to them, the Gospel of Luke says, as idle tales. They had the same attitude. Yeah, women. They're upset about this. We're all upset, but they're women, and so they're imagining this dramatic scene, and but we don't believe it. We're suspicious enough, we'll run and see what's going on. Then, of course, you have the very human touch of John being younger, outrunning Peter, who's older, and it's kind of fun. But then John gets there and holds off for Peter to go in first because he's the senior apostle. But this is a very human story. To me, it's so different to have her latching on to him than to have that. And I've heard lessons, sadly, in gospel doctrine classes and so on about what does it mean that she's not allowed to touch him. Well, maybe one person actually suggested maybe a resurrected body has to be sort of certified or finished in the presence of the Father. If you touch it before that, who knows, it might fall apart or something like that. Oh, come on. No, but it just, the whole thing dissolves. It's just not true. So here are our unofficial witnesses, and 5 of them are women, which I think is interesting. The Lord is saying, look, I'm not going to put them in the official list, but they're here. and as the church grows, we learn more about the history, we discover actually there were women who were testifying at the same time that the men were. So to me, it's powerful. Now, I want to say something about, and I'm almost done. Yeah, I think I will make it. I want to say something about the official witnesses, though, and how they strengthen each other. I used to believe, as I said, that maybe it was redundant to have the 8 witnesses. Why? I mean, the 3 witnesses are pretty powerful. Then it struck me, no, and I learned this really from B.H. Roberts, who makes the argument. He was a very clever man. He says, look, you have 2 different experiences. The 3 witnesses go out and they have this kind of, my language, not his, this kind of industrial light and magic vision, the voice of God, an angel, supernatural stuff everywhere. And you could, if you want, I suppose, write that off as hallucination. It's imagination. It's not real. Now, there's a problem with that, which is that hallucinations don't typically happen in groups. There's been a lot of medical studies on this. If you put people in a room and you introduce gas of a certain kind, many of them will hallucinate at a certain point. The trouble is they won't hallucinate the same thing, because they'll hallucinate based on their own personalities, their own backgrounds, their own psyches, and so on. They will have different visions. But these people all see the same thing, and even separately. Martin Harris has the same vision that David and Oliver have later in the day in a separate location. There is one account that says the 8 witnesses didn't have their experience all at the same time, but in 2 groups of 4. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's possible. Anyway, the 8 witnesses have this totally matter-of-fact experience. You could write that off and say, well, Joseph manufactured some props. He brought them in and faked them out with a fake set of plates or something like that. But that doesn't explain the 3 witnesses. And the experience of the 3 witnesses, hallucination, doesn't explain the totally matter-of-fact experience of the 8 witnesses. Do you see what I'm saying? That the 2 taken together are really powerful because they're so different. And then you bring in the unofficial witnesses who have these experiences separately, sometimes under very unfavorable conditions, not exactly spiritual. Mary Whitmer is wanting to throw them off her property, and Lucy Harris is really angry and thinking that her husband is being swindled. She's not exactly looking for a spiritual experience, but she has one. And so they're mutually reinforcing, it seems to me, because they're so very different. I think it's just impressive to know that there are so many of them. As I say, I want to add one more to this list. So altogether you'd have 19 there, plus Joseph Smith. That's 20 people. I think it may be significant, by the way, that with the 3 and the 8 witnesses, the official ones, plus Joseph, you have 12, which is the traditional number of a jury in Western Anglo-American common law. But look at all the names there. And a lot of different people having different experiences at separate times. Now, why is this important? Book of Mormon the witnesses are really important because they testify the Book of Mormon is true, that there is something divine going on here. It's not just Joseph Smith's subjective experience. There are real objects there. People have hefted them, touched them, moved them around, struggled under their weight. They've heard the voice of God. They've seen an angel. All sorts of things going on here that say the Book of Mormon is true. God really intervened at a point in history in the late 1820s to bring back a book and to restore his gospel. And it's not just Joseph Smith. You can explain Joseph Smith away if you want to try, but then you're left with all these people. Where'd they come from? What did they see? Fawn Brodie at one point, responding to the Mary Whitmer story, says, Joseph must have marveled at his ability to induce visions in other people, even when he wasn't there. Well, yeah, he should marvel. How on earth do you do that? It's one thing to write a sentence like that, but the sentence is stupid. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But why is this important? Because it demonstrates that God was present at the beginning of the Restoration, that God is there at the beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I will say something even more important than that. It testifies, as we all know, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is a painting from one of my favorite places on the planet. It's a little church just outside of Istanbul, former Constantinople, called the Kora Church. It means the country church. And this is an image of Jesus making his visit to the spirit world between the time of his crucifixion and his resurrection. And you see him, he's lifting Adam and Eve out of their tombs, and you have the damned and the saved hoping to be taken out of spirit prison. And this is a very ancient doctrine that was basically lost in Christianity, by the way, until Joseph F. Smith's vision of the redemption of the dead. Another really interesting subject in and of itself. But I really love the detail under Jesus. You see he's standing on what look like a couple of boards. Do a close-up. Underneath them you can see Satan is bound. He's wrapped up like a mummy. And you see all the lock mechanisms of the gates of hell smashed because Jesus came and just flattened the door and the lock has exploded. And he's literally standing on Satan and pulling the saved out of the spirit world. And what the Book of Mormon testifies is this is true, that Jesus came into the world to redeem the world, and to redeem not only those who were alive at the time, but all those who had come thereafter, and those who lived before. And so there you have that marvelous scene in that little church in the little suburban area of Istanbul, which I love, and I think this is one of the great Christian images ever. And so I just want to bear you my testimony. Man, I cannot believe I did this. Anyway, I want to bear you my testimony that these things are true. I don't honestly know, and I've tried to get around the witnesses and think of some way to explain them away, and I can't do it. They lived long lives, most of them, bearing testimony to the ends of their lives, even when they were separated from the church, and they could have gained a lot by telling the, quote, truth about Joseph. And, spilling the beans about the plot and the imposture. They don't do it. They go on to their dying days bearing their testimonies, and some of them suffer a great deal for it. So I bear you my testimony that their testimony is plausible because it's true, and they stayed true to it because it was true. And I bear you that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So, I think that they're going to invite questions. Now, I've said before, they asked me if I was willing to take questions. I am, because I taught for a living at BYU. One of the skills you develop as a professor is the ability to glibly explain anything, even if you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm never scared of questions because I'm nothing if not glib.
So I'm new. So then is the work that we're doing in the temple with the baptizing of our ancestors and our families, is that doing Christ's work of redeeming the dead out of purgatory or wherever they were lost?
Yeah, I mean, purgatory is not altogether wrong. We don't use that word, but it's sort of the same thing. I mean, the spirit world is where people are waiting to hear the gospel, and when they hear it, they still need the ordinance of baptism, which for some reason can't be done in the spirit world, but can be done by us here on their behalf. And so that's what we do. And let me tell you a quick story about that. Years ago, we were doing what was called the Encyclopedia of Mormonism from Macmillan Publishing, and one of the articles that we were going to do was on baptism for the dead in antiquity, and we wanted to get Christer Stendahl to do it. Christer Stendahl was a professor of New Testament at Harvard Divinity School and Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm, an authority on the Gospel of Matthew, but the whole New Testament. And so we tried to get him to do it, and he said, "No, I don't have time. I can't do it. You just write something up." And Truman Madsen was a friend of his. Some of you will know that name. And Truman kept pestering him to write this article. So we wanted a non-Latter-day Saint to do this article about baptism for the dead in ancient times. And so Christer Stendahl says, "Oh, you really want me to do this? Okay. Why don't you write one up and then I'll approve it and make any modifications that have to be made." So Truman wrote up a short little article on baptism for the dead in antiquity. And when he sent it to Christer Stendahl back at Harvard, Stendahl said, "No, this is terrible. This isn't a good article at all." So he wrote a new article finally pestered him into doing it. But one of the things he says is, look, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15:29 the idea of baptism for the dead. And he said, there is no other way of taking that. And every modern scholar who is worth anything takes that as meaning vicarious baptism on behalf of the dead. And he says the only reason you wouldn't take it that way is if you had some theological axe to grind and you wanted to escape it. But he says that's plainly what Paul is talking about. We couldn't have asked for a better statement than that. So anyway, and that is the view, I think, of almost all New Testament scholars today, unless they're trying desperately to escape the Latter-day Saint idea. So Stendhal did say, by the way, I love the practice of baptism for the dead. I could imagine myself participating in such a thing.
So how did you get involved in studying the official and unofficial witnesses of the church, and how long have you studied them for?
Well, you know, I've been reading about them for years, since I was I read Richard Anderson's book when it first came out in whatever it was, 89 or something like that. And so it was on the back burner, but I read whatever I could see. There wasn't that much about them. And I just thought these are really impressive witnesses. They're sane, reputable men, and then I discovered women too, who never denied what they saw, what they heard, what they felt, and so on. And I thought, yeah, this is difficult to get around, and we need to know more about them. And again, I felt the Lord gave this testimony to us, and we're not doing as much with it as we should. So if nobody else will do it, I will. And then when the opportunity came to do this film, boy, I remember the call. Our neighbor called up and said, look, are you busy tonight? Could you come down to my house? Mark and James are here with me, Russ, and we want to talk to you about something. And they proposed the idea of a film on the witnesses, and they were prepared to persuade me into it. And I said, yes, I'd love to do that, because I think this is really important stuff, and difficult to escape, difficult to evade. I mean, by the time you've got roughly 20 people bearing testimony to seeing the plates, hearing an angel, hearing the voice of God, all those sorts of things, that's a pretty good crowd of witnesses. So there are actually others that I could mention that had visions of the plates or an angel and things like that, but I've left them out because they weren't there at the very formative time.
I actually have a question, since I have the mic. Do we know who penned the actual testimony of the three witnesses?
We don't know for sure. We think it was Oliver Cowdery. And then some people have said, well, but we don't have the original document. We don't have their signatures. So how do we know they believed it? Well, because they brought testimony in interviews and everything else for the next decades. And if one of them had ever said, oh, I didn't sign that, I don't believe that, I never had that experience, we'd know about it. But they all do. Originally was a document written, I think, by Oliver, and then signed by all three, all eight, for the 8 witnesses, but we don't have that. That part of the Book of Mormon manuscript is gone.
You like mine better than yours, Patty?
So there's about 18 then that you've talked about witnesses.
Yeah.
Of the 18, how many of those at their death actually had not come back to the church, who were still estranged from the church?
Of the 3 witnesses, 2 had not come back. Oliver was on his way, but he died in Missouri before he could join the Saints. He'd actually come back and been rebaptized, but had not made it out. He got sick. He had tuberculosis and died. David never did. David was, I think if you looked up the word cantankerous or the word curmudgeon in the dictionary, there'd be a picture of David Whitmer there, which makes him a really strong witness, by the way, because he will not back down from anything that he believes. Martin Harris did come back. He came back in 1870. He was brought out. The very first person who donated money when it became apparent he might be willing to come was Brigham Young. And then people took up a subscription to get him out to Utah. But he said, look, I'm going to look around, and I'm not going to join your church. I'm not I'm going to go back. And then he came out and his words on seeing Salt Lake, and this is Salt Lake in 1870, it can't have been much, but he said, who would have thought that the Book of Mormon did all this? And he's rebaptized and everything. So he comes back. Out of the 8 witnesses, he's the only one, by the way, out of all of the official witnesses who makes it to Utah. Hiram Smith dies with Joseph in Carthage jail. Several of the others had already died before that. Another one dies shortly thereafter. And so the only ones that are left really are the Whitmers, and they stay and they form a kind of family house church there in Richmond, where they had the manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which they venerated, and they hold meetings in their home, but they never join the church out west. So, but they're the only ones really left after that.
So what would you say, if you could just say it in one sentence, what do you think that's a lot of people who left the church. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And that surprises me. What do you think the main reason is overall? Why?
I don't know if I can do it in one sentence, but I'll try to do it quickly.
Right.
Oliver Cowdery was upset about certain things like the management of the Kirtland Bank. And Martin Harris was upset about that too. David Whitmer was upset because he didn't like the way the church was growing. I think he liked it when it was a small group meeting in homes, when they began having presidencies and high priests and things like that. He didn't like that. So he's disaffected from that. Martin Harris is, I think there's some bruised ego there. When we show it in the film, he says, David and Oliver have been given high and holy callings, and what have I ever done? I've always been stuck with the church's bills. Every time you need money, you come to me, because I'm the one that made some money. And he's not happy with that. I think there's a real sense that he wanted to have some honor in the community, and he didn't get as much as he thought he should. So he's very human. Several of the others die of diseases and so on. It's the persecutions in Missouri that really do them in. A lot of people leave the church then. So by the time you get to Nauvoo, there are none of them left except Hiram, really.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've just been wondering, do you think there would have been a difference if all 3 had stayed faithful?
Yeah, I think there might have been, although in some ways I like the fact that David remains faithful to his testimony out of the church. He's out of the church for 50 years, after about 1838, to his death in 1888. So much longer than he was in it. And yet he still bears this firm testimony. Well, he's got no support from any church mechanisms or anything like that. Nobody's encouraging him. There'd be a lot of people who would have paid good money to hear him denounce the church, and he won't do it. So in some ways, I think he's more powerful outside than in. But yeah, it might have been different. Oliver Cowdery, I think, might have, well, who knows what would have happened with Oliver Cowdery. He was the assistant president of the church at one point, a position we no longer have. I've speculated what would have happened if he'd remained faithful. Would he have died as a second witness at Carthage jail? I think it's very possible that he might have. Hiram Smith, who succeeded to that role of assistant president, did die in Carthage jail. He was probably intended, Joseph was hoping, that he would be his successor in the presidency. But that possibility is eliminated when he dies, and he dies, interestingly, before Joseph. So there's never even a split second where he's the senior apostle. He's gone before Joseph is. So was that Oliver's role, possibly? Joseph didn't know exactly what was going to happen in terms of succession until, and this is a story we tell we'll be telling in our mini documentary series about the succession crisis, and in our film 6 Days in August, that Joseph settled on the 12 as the second quorum of the church fairly late, after their mission to England in 1840. And then it's pretty clear to him, and I think to any historian looking at it, that was the way he was going to go. So it was not going to be Joseph III or Sidney Rigdon or anybody like that. It was going to be the 12. So, but yeah, how would it have been different if they'd remained faithful? It's hard to know. Impossible to know, really. So, yeah.
Are you familiar with the book Plates of Gold by Matthew Brown.
Yes, yes.
Are there any inconsistencies in the scholarship there that you know of, or?
Not that I can think of. No, it's been a while since I've read it, but no. Is there one you're thinking of?
No, I just really liked that book and
Yeah.
enjoyed it a lot.
No, it's a good book. He was a good guy.
And then you mentioned Truby G. Matson earlier.
Yeah.
And he expound on what you said earlier. He was in his 8 lectures on faith. He talks about several things that you've mentioned, but one is the succession.
Yeah.
And especially the fact that all 12 knew that they were going to be, because he had the summary of the summary before he died, and he's like, now it's all on you.
Yeah.
And they were like,
I don't
they
think
didn't write it down. They should have written it down, but they didn't.
Yeah, they didn't understand what he. Yeah, I think it's like the apostles in the New Testament. Jesus will say to them over and over again, you know, the day will come that the Son of Man will be lifted up. Da, 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 you know, and they're all going, yeah. And when he dies, they're stunned. They can't believe it. He's such a vivid personality. They can't imagine life without him. And then they kind of have to step forward and pick up the mantle, if you will. I think that's true of the 12 with the death of Joseph Smith, that if there's one thing that's become apparent to me studying Brigham Young, is that he was absolutely dedicated to following what Joseph wanted to do. But Brigham would not defer to just about anybody. Brigham was, some of you may have the impression, a fairly strong personality. But he would bend the knee before Joseph. There's one famous case where Joseph rebukes him for something. I can't even remember what it was about. It was kind of rough, and everyone was standing by waiting to see how Brigham would respond. And his next line was, "Joseph, what would you have me do?" Which blew everyone away. Because Joseph was his leader. And so I did an interview with Ron Esplin, who is the authority on the succession crisis. And he says, look, basically, if you wanted to continue with the program that Joseph Smith had outlined, which basically came down to 2 big things at that point, the trek westward, but also the completion of the Nauvoo Temple, which seem almost mutually contradictory. Finish the temple and then abandon it and go west. But that was what Joseph was planning on doing. The only group, Ron Esplin says, that was going to carry out Joseph's program was the 12. The others weren't going to. I mean, the RLDS Church, to an extent, has abandoned the temple, and to a large extent has abandoned the temple, and they didn't go west. And most of the other people, Sidney Rigdon, would not have carried on with that kind of program. They would have said, well, you know, the gathering has gotten us in trouble, let's just drop it. We won't gather together anymore, we won't build temples, too risky. The 12 said, no, we will. I think one of the great stories of Brigham Young is, and we show it in the film 6 Days in August, is when they're called to go on a mission to England, and they're told that they're to take leave of the United States from the cornerstone of the Far West Temple on such and such a date. Well, by the time that date comes around, they've had to abandon Missouri. So I would have said, well, you know, this was just advice. That's where you start your journey. It's no longer applicable. Brigham and several of the 12 sneak in to Missouri under cover of darkness and take their leave from the cornerstone of the Far West Temple, because that's what Joseph Smith told them to do, and that's what they were going to do. And that says a whole lot about Brigham Young and his faithfulness to the prophet. Any other questions or objections? There's one over here. Yeah.
Knowing how important the temple is in our lives, I was wondering how many of the 8 witnesses and the 3 received the ordinances of the temple?
Very few of them had. Several of them had died by then, and the Whitmers were out of the church. So Hiram did, of the 8 witnesses. Martin Harris did eventually. He came out to Utah and received his endowment in the endowment house in Salt Lake City. Most had not. I'm sure all of their work has been done now. But yeah, I mean, the church was still rapidly changing. in those days. And so the church, this is part of the problem. David Whitmer said, I didn't leave the church left me. The church was changing so rapidly, we could hardly imagine it. Even in our day, when there have been a lot of changes made, nothing compared to the 1830s, where new doctrines and new ordinances were coming in almost every month. So,
in your opinion, it would have been super easy for the Lord just to show the plates or like have them, like there's 100 different ways that could have gone, right? That
Yeah.
if you want to convert an entire people,
yeah.
why, in your opinion, why would he not have done that and just been more transparent, as it were?
I have no idea. Obviously he could have, but he never seems to do things that way. I mean, when the Savior is resurrected, you have a handful of witnesses. At most, you have some people out on the Mount Ascension outside of Jerusalem. But he could have appeared in the Roman Forum or in the Senate in Rome or something like that, appear before the Sanhedrin, say, hey, I'm back. You killed me and here I am. That would have made an impression, but he doesn't seem to do things that way. And, when he does appear and come into mortality, he appears in a backwater area of a backwater province of the Roman Empire. Not even in Jerusalem as such. When he calls a prophet in the latter days, he calls a guy with a name, it's almost comic, Joseph Smith. It's got to be the most common name in the United States. Even today, if you look at a map, what's the most common name in most states? It's Smith, even now. And so he calls this backwoods bumpkin guy out of, outside of Palmyra. He just doesn't seem to call on academics or senators or governors or things like that. Usually doesn't make a big public spectacle. Now, I know skeptics will say, yeah, it's because it never really happened. It only happens among frontier rubes. Okay, if you want to read it that way, I guess you can. But if you believe it at all, then it's pretty clear the Lord has a pattern, and it's not doing it in a transparent, very public way. But why he does it that way, I don't know. I imagine we'll find out.
So I've really loved listening to your arc of everything that you've done, but my ears pricked up when you talked about the filming, because you said that the church came in and said that we don't want all this drama, and you had to sort of tone it down a little bit. And my dad...
They didn't want us to tone it down. They said they had to.
Oh, you mean you filmed it the way you wanted to?
Oh, yeah.
And then they only cut what they want? Okay.
No, they like what we're doing. One of them said to me, we like what you're doing. We can't do it, but we're glad that you're doing it.
So, but they had to cut it to display it somewhere, or you just didn't have to do it?
No. Oh. Nope, they haven't edited it at all. And in fact, dare I say this, when we did our premiere of 6 Days in August, I was really pleased that President Oakes came, and Elder Stevenson of the 12, and 3 or 4 members of the 70, and then Elder Holland told me afterwards that he said, you should have heard the Quorum of the 12 First Presidency meeting after that premiere. He said, President Oakes told everybody in the 12, you've got to see this movie, and take your families.
The reason I ask is because my dad is a cousin to Leonard Arrington, and he's that last very special historian that our church had. So there are these issues of toning it down.
Right.
So
I think we've, dare I say it, grown up a little bit since then. I don't mean that to sound as condescending as it does, but I think we're recognizing now that we tell our history warts and all. That's better.
Well,
because the warts aren't that bad, and if people are pre-warned, inoculated, Richard Bushman likes the term inoculation, and I do too. We've talked about this, that you give people a sense of what happened, even the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then when some critic comes along and says, look at this, so yeah, I already knew all that.
yes, and the Book of Mormon is a little bit hard in places, so it's not edited.
Right. Yeah, but no, the church likes what we're doing. In fact, I can say this, I'm very pleased. We're now doing these short video documentaries they were calling Becoming Brigham. They'll start coming out around January 1st, I think. And we're just going to flood them out there. The idea is not to make any money from them, just put them out wherever we can so that people can watch them. 52, maybe more than that, weekly 15-minute documentaries. And the church historical department has gotten really enthused about this. In fact, to the extent they're worrying me, they're proposing new episodes, more interviews, bigger budget, which I have to raise. And but they really like it because we're doing good historical work and taking their lead, doing interviews with their people, and telling difficult stories. I did some interviews of 2 or 3 weeks ago about Latter-day Saint relations with Native Americans in Utah in the 19th century, and it's not always comfortable. And Latter-day Saints don't always come off looking very well. Even Brigham Young, at one point, says he regrets something that he did. And he said, the Lord prompted me not to do that, and I did it anyway, and I regret it. You know, but there were mistakes that were made.
Okay. So why do you think that Emma wasn't shown the plates? Mary Whitmer was shown the plates because she was enduring such hard times.
Yeah.
Emma did a lot of hard times too.
I know. I have no idea why not. And as I say, I sometimes want to ask her, come on, Emma, did you see them? But if she did, it would have been a stolen glance, I think. And as she says she didn't. She was insistent that she did not. But she did feel them from every angle, move one plate against the other, listen to the metallic sound, and so on. So she said, I knew he had an object there that was metal. But why she didn't see it and Mary Whitmer did, I don't know. My friend Royal Skousen thinks that Mary Whitmer was just on the verge of throwing Joseph and Oliver out. And that had she done that, that might have set the work back who knows how many months. So she had to be given some encouragement. No, I don't think Emma would have, and so maybe that's the difference, that Emma wouldn't have thrown them out, but Mary was about to. So it was an emergency intervention.
Yeah, so the witnesses themselves are, a powerful testimony of the Book of Mormon as well as the translation. I wanted to know a little bit more about the process of translation. I know some people mention about the Urim and Thummim being used, others the seer stone, and what is your take on that? I know it can be controversial. Sometimes people say maybe it's this one, maybe.
Well, there's kind of a debate among scholars of the Book of Mormon right now about what the nature of the translation was. There are some, and this has been a standard view for a long time, that it's kind of a loose translation, that it was translated into Joseph's vocabulary, his language, and so on. There's another theory which I think has good evidence for it, which is that, in a sense, Joseph wasn't the translator at all. He read the translation in the Urim and Thummim. It was given to him, and it wasn't his language. And this is very peculiar. Royal and another fellow named John Carmack, a couple of PhD linguists, have been studying the language of the Book of Mormon, and they argue that it's not King James English, and it's not the English of Joseph's dialect in the 19th century in New York. It's English from about 1350 through 1580. It's what's called early modern English, which is really strange. And I don't know why that would be the case, but it's English that's foreign to Joseph. It's not King James. It's not 19th century American English. It's English from a slightly earlier period. And why that would be, I've asked Royal and Stan both. Why would the Lord do that? Don't know. We're just reporting on what we found. That time and time again, you find words that are used in senses that were obsolete by the time of the King James Bible, verb forms that were obsolete already by then. And I've wondered, I have a kind of irreverent sense of these things. I sometimes think, is this kind of a divine joke? That someday you'll notice this and you'll think, that is really strange. And what it'll tell you is this is something that no critic of the Book of Mormon can explain. Even the Latter-day Saints will think that's really weird, but at least we can figure out a supernatural way it could have happened. But for a critic who believes there's nothing divine or supernatural in it, how do you explain that Joseph has access to English that stopped being spoken 250 years before he was born? Very odd. So in that sense, Joseph is reading the translation off of the stone. And we do know that at some points he would have to spell words out. When he got to a long name, he couldn't pronounce it. He wasn't very well educated, so he'd spell it out and Oliver would write it. At one point we have Oliver writing the word Coriantumr, the name of Coriantumr, and he spells it with an M-E-R at the end. And then Joseph must have corrected him. And there's a slash through it, like, oh, it's kind of an angry, long slash. Like, how in the world could I possibly have known how this word was spelled? There's not a single word in English that ends in M-R. M-E-R, yeah, but M-R, nothing. So Oliver's saying, come on. But Joseph himself is reading these things, and he's seeing them for the first time. There's a wonderful story where he is reading along and he reads about the walls of Jerusalem. You may know this story. And he says, Emma, did Jerusalem have a wall around it? And she says, well, yeah, I think it did. And he says, oh, good. I worried that maybe I was being deceived. But he would run into things he'd never seen before, and they surprised him. He had not seen this. The other one that's really interesting is that when you get to the end of 1 Nephi, if you read the action there, 1 Nephi goes seamlessly into 2 Nephi. I mean, there's just no break, really, except it's a new book. Well, Joseph had Oliver write at the beginning of each chapter. And they do that at the beginning of 2 Nephi. It says chapter. And then it's crossed out, 2 Nephi, because they didn't know there was a new book coming. So it's clear to me that Joseph is reading things that he doesn't expect. He's not familiar with the text. He's never seen it before. And he has a hard time with it sometimes, reading the proper nouns and things like that. It's difficult for him. So that's something we know about the translation. And I think Royal and Stan have made the case really strongly that it's not Joseph's language. It's language that's coming from somewhere else. I don't know where. But, but that's a kind of miracle because I can't think of any way it would happen. How did Joseph channel English from 1400? Not possible. Anyway, yeah.
I just have a question about the wives of the witnesses.
Yeah.
Is there any record of their testimony, of the testimonies of their husbands, or their own faithfulness about what they may have experienced?
Yeah, there is. We have words from Oliver Cowdery's widow, who said, "Oh yeah, he was faithful. He always believed. Even in his darkest hours, he believed in the Book of Mormon." And there are a lot of miracle stories and so on. The wives were very supportive of those men and continued to give accounts of them. In some cases, after their deaths. No, not that I know of. Now. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing. It would be. There's so much work to be done among these materials in early Latter-day Saint history. I think that would be a great book. Yeah, the wives of the witnesses. It would be tremendous. Now, you'd have Lucy Harris there, and she's a bit of a mixed bag, but and she died not long after, by the way. She was not well and died fairly young. But Oliver Cowdery's wife outlives him. She returns to the church with him. I mean, she's right there with him all the time. So, yeah, good idea. Maybe you should do it. Yeah.
Why were the plates taken away?
Why were the plates taken away? That's another one where I just can't second guess the Lord. I suppose if we still had them, there'd be endless debates about whether they were translated correctly, doing metallurgical tests on them and things like that. You take them away and say, look, this is an object of faith, period. They existed. We have testimonies that they existed. People saw them, held them, hefted them, lifted them, carried them. But we don't have them now. Now, that's something that critics raise a lot. There were plates and they're gone. Well, yeah, I mean, it would be nice to have them in some ways. On the other hand, there's enough testimony that I think there's very little doubt that Joseph had some heavy metal object in the late 1820s. I mean, I just can't see any way around that. I know there are people out there, I have regular encounters with them, who say there just were no plates. Well, you can't make that argument. You've got 20 or so witnesses who say there were. There's a new biography out of Joseph Smith by John Butler, who is not John Butler, John Turner. John Butler's a geneticist friend of mine. I get the names mixed up all the time. John Turner's a really good guy. He's not LDS, teaches in Virginia. On the whole, he's a friend of Latter-day Saints, but in his new biography of Joseph Smith, he just flat out says there were no plates. And I just want to grab him by the collar and shake him and say, John, how can you say that? You at least have to make an argument. Don't just wave the evidence aside, you know. But that's been a steady response from a lot of critics. I just don't see that they can make it. I can see, you can say, well, it's odd that they're not here. Okay, I get that. But so many people saw them and held them, estimated their weight, turned the pages. Are all these people hallucinating? Or all of them lying? For what reason? Doesn't make any sense. But I don't know why they're not here anymore. I can speculate, I don't know. My wife is giving me the sign, but is there another?
So just real quick.
Yeah.
I heard years ago that there was a program that's good at finding ghostwriters.
Oh.
And they tried using it against the Book of Mormon, and it showed that everything where it's talking about Mormons talking here and Almo's talking here, they are definite different people.
Yes.
Is that something?
Yeah. That's
true.
really
I heard
important.
it. I don't know if it's true. So
no, it is absolutely true. It's called word print analysis. And what you do is you look at non-contextual words like and, the, of, prepositions, things like that don't have much to do with the content. But it turns out that individual writers have different styles, almost like a fingerprint. They call it a word print. If you can get enough of their writing, then compare it with a sizable enough amount of some other writing, you can compare. And the studies show that Joseph Smith is not the author of the Book of Mormon, nor is Sidney Rigdon, or any of the others who've been proposed as candidate authors. And the even more interesting thing to me is that some of the writers don't have enough writing in the Book of Mormon that we can judge. And some of it is edited, goes through Mormons' hands and so on. But you can tell distinctive styles. Nephi is different than Mormon, who is different than Moroni. And that's really interesting, because it's really hard for even a good novelist to fake that change in style. And yet Joseph Smith, this 2.5-month educated country rube, without even knowing he's trying to evade word print analysis, manages to do it. Not plausible. It's not plausible at all. So that, to me, is really strong evidence, and it has not been undercut. There have been attacks on it, but I think it holds up pretty well. Yeah, that's a really important thing, that whoever the author of the Book of Mormon is, it's nobody in the 19th century that we've been able to identify. So, and there are different styles within the book. So, very interesting. Well, I think my wife was giving me, as I say, the sign. She's very useful.
I'm supposed to,
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me.
We want to thank the Petersons for taking time out of their vacation and sharing with us. I just wanted to share, we have a couple new members of the High Council, and we had a meeting with the State Council on Thursday. And as President George does, he always has the new High Council members bear their testimony, and it was very touching, because this brother said, I don't know a lot, I'm just a dumb farm boy from Idaho, but I know when I read the Book of Mormon, I'm a better person, I feel that it's divine, and that leads me that Joseph Smith's a prophet. It was interesting. It was just and I think our hope tonight is to inspire all of us to take the Book of Mormon more seriously, as the prophets have told us, and to gain our own witness. Again, thank you to the Petersons. We'll close this evening, and I think Brother John Mwala from the Pacific Ward will give us our closing prayer.
Our dear Father in heaven, we come before Thee at the closing of our fireside with gratitude in our hearts for the wonderful spirit that was here. We're grateful, Heavenly Father, for the words that were shared with us through Dr. Peterson. We're grateful for his testimony and for the opportunity that we had to strengthen our testimony in the Book of Mormon. We pray, Heavenly Father, for Thy Spirit to be with us throughout the rest of this night. Please bless us as we travel home, that we travel with safety. And these things we humbly do pray for in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.